This is the Hope Not Note podcast,
where we answer your questions and share inspirational stories to fill your soul with hope.
Our mission is to empower hope to those who have been plagued by note.
I'm Dr. Dylan Caswell.
And I'm Brandy.
And we're here to bring you out of the note and into hope.
Welcome to the Hope Not Note podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Fist bump!
Ow. Your ring was aggressive. Ow. Well, we're excited that you're tuning in and happy to be here with Dylan the goofball.
I was going to say our podcast is injury free, but is your hand okay?
Yeah, it's all right.
Cool.
Okay. But hopefully it'll help prevent injuries with this next topic. So our question is from Grayson, and he asks, do I need to train my tendons differently than my muscles for injury prevention?
Grayson, that is a high-level question.
And we didn't even plan for you to punch my fist with your ring and me getting an injury.
If you're listening and not watching, we just pounded the potato.
Yeah.
But I was excited, and my ring just went a little hard at Brandy's hand. But Grayson, great question. And if you're wondering, right, muscle, tendon, ligaments, it kind of all can get confusing, right? So tendons are what attach muscles to the bone. So muscles attach to tendon, the tendon then attaches the muscle to the bone. Ligaments attach bone to bone. So ligaments protect the joint, the tendon protects and anchors down the muscle group. So when we look at injury prevention, we know that the number one thing that's going to help prevent injury is strength. Strength is the vaccine to injuries in the sports medicine field. The more strength that you have, the more protected that muscle is. Now, with that being said, there's also a conditioning component. Like if you have a lot of sprinting, your training should have some sprints in them to get ready for the demands of that particular activity. But if you train for those demands, you match the intensity, you're likely going to have a healthy season, which is a great thing. But when we look at this, we used to look at the muscles and the tendons and just say, load them up, they'll adapt. And now what we've learned is that tendons are kind of like, they're divas. They require a little extra attention, where the muscles are just kind of like the jocks. Like, oh, we're taking on load, sweet. I'll adapt and get strong. Where the tendons are like, hey, no, I require very specific things for this. And I say that, but let me pull back and just say, if you have a well-rounded program, you're probably addressing both. If you don't have a well-rounded program, you're likely not addressing both. But what ends up happening if the muscle gets stronger, but the tendon doesn't adapt? And the tendon is an anchor point. So we have an anchor point and we have more force pulling on an anchor point that hasn't become more stable. What's going to happen to that anchor point? It's going to get irritated. It can potentially get overused, or it can potentially strain or tear. So we have to make sure that in our prevention programs that we're doing stuff that addresses the tendon, the anchor point, so as the muscle gets stronger and pulls on it, that it's able to withstand that force. So then what does train the tendon versus the muscle, or in conjunction with? And again, a muscle, you can load it with lighter load and do high reps. You can load it with higher weights and lower reps, and the muscle is going to get stronger. It's going to adapt. But the tendon really enjoys heavy, slow loading. We used to think just eccentrics, like lengthening, but then we learned that it's not actually the eccentric. It's because eccentrics you can do a higher weight with. So for example, an eccentric would be like if we're on a quad extension machine and someone helps you to get your knee extended so where it's straight, or you use both legs to lift it and then take one away and you lower it, we can move more load in the lowering phase than we can back to the shortening phase. So it used to be thought eccentrics for tendon loading, but the reality is it was just because of the heavier load. So for tendons, heavier, slow load is what gets them to adapt structurally. And there's kind of two key researchers in this area, Dr. Falk Meserman, who is, I think, from Germany, and then Dr. Gerald McMahon, who I think is from Ireland. And they've looked at tendons and they've looked at it with ultrasound, viewing the tendon integrity and seeing, well, what load adapts the actual tendon? And they found that at these bigger tendons in the lower extremities, so the patellar tendon, the Achilles tendon, the hamstring tendon, 60 to 85% of a 1 rep max for a range of 8 to 12 reps tends to load it. So again, heavier loads, 60 to 85% of a 1 rep max is a pretty heavy load. And then that rep scheme, it's a pretty heavy, slow load. There's a lot of time under tension, right? In the upper extremity with things like the rotator cuff, it's not as large as a muscle group. So the rep scheme goes 8 reps to 15 reps, but the percentage is going to go down to like 60 to 75%. So just kind of still heavy, but on the lower end of it. So with this, what we've found is that if we're gaining muscle and we're able to produce more force, the anchor points need to also become more adaptable. And by heavy, slow loading, we're able to get those tendons to become more adaptable. Vice versa, when a tendon becomes sore, we have to ask the question of, did the tendon adapt to the forces that the muscle is pulling on it? And if not, well, then we have to use heavy, slow loading to help it recover and get back to what it needs to be able to do. So heavy, slow loading for tendons when it comes to the force production. And then if we're looking at elasticity, and what elasticity is basically is like how springy of an athlete are you? That when you're running, there's the gazelle runners that just like float when they run, and there's the pound the pavement runners. The elastic athlete is the floating athlete. They're able to put force into the ground, it's able to return back, and they're efficient because this is all working by a component of the tendon that stores elasticity, the parallel series component. The way that you train that part of it is with repetitive plyometrics. So we have one end that to train the anchor of the tendon, make them resilient to the muscles pulling on them, we need heavy, slow loading. And to become more elastic, that type of loading is going to be a little bit different, but we can't even get to that type of loading until the heavy, slow loading has been done effectively.
So with all of this in your research and in your knowledge, is there any, I guess, type of sport or type of training that is more likely to have like a tendon injury versus a muscle injury? Like, have you learned that anywhere? Or because I'm thinking like, okay, so like high school athletes, like when I was a high school athlete, we were not in the weight room.
Yeah.
So like our training was just like in the gym or on the softball field or just like running the roads near my high school. Like there wasn't any like there was no weight room that we were going in other than like a little bit, but like not at all, basically. Now I know for like collegiate athletes, that's where it would start to change. They're in the weight room more. And then I'm thinking of like, people in their 20s and 30s, they're going to the gym. Maybe they're in a competitive like league around here, but like say they're in a slow pitch softball league or a kickball league, like that might be their activity. They may not be going to the gym, but they still may want to prevent injury. So these are all just different examples, but in your research and in your knowledge, are there specific types of athletes that are more likely to get injured that should be aware if they're listening?
Yeah, I'll kind of try to break it into categories, and you tell me if it makes sense from the terms that I'm using.
Okay.
But the athletes that can produce a lot of force are the ones that would benefit a lot from making sure their tendons are ready for that type of force. Because if you got this strong thing pulling on an anchor point that has not adapted well, yeah, some issues are going to happen. So
by force, do you mean like explosiveness?
Yeah.
So like I think football, like you're on the line, you're waiting, and then once the ball snaps, like you have to explode.
Yep.
So that's force versus like I don't know, maybe like a marathon runner. There's still force obviously within marathon running, but there's like you're not like exploding and sprinting, I guess, sprint efforts.
100%. Yeah. So if we looked at like a slow pitch softball league, it'd be like the shortstop and the left fielder and left center fielder. Like the ones that are steady, and then instantly they have to sprint and cover a lot of ground because they're getting a lot of the plays that they're making.
Or the try hard, like not try hard, that's rude, but like the try hard like hitters, the ones that are like, I'm gonna fricking send this ball and see how far I can go because they're running around the bases, so like they're gonna try and run around the bases quickly.
The athlete that's hitting the triple,
Yeah.
they don't quite have the ability to get it over the fence, but they can get it to the fence, and they're legging out a triple because they're mad that they didn't hit it over the fence, so they're just legging it out. So these are the athletes that can produce a lot of force with movement. I mean, right, so home run hitter, they're producing a lot of force, but it's rotational force and they're kind of staying in a similar type of plane as they go to hit. Or they're not exploding out. So they're getting a lot of rotational power, but they're not getting a lot of like sprint type power, right? So I think with hitters, right, that's a different type of force production than like an explosive field athlete.
Yeah.
Now, would they both benefit from their tendons being ready for it? Absolutely. And it gets into the conversation too, not to get too much into the anatomy, but what is the tendon length to the muscle length? So when we look at a muscle like the groin has a shorter tendon attachment than other muscles, which kind of predisposes that to groin injuries because the anchor point's smaller, which means that this smaller thing is taking on more force per sectional area compared to a tendon that's longer and can disperse it out further.
So a groin injury is more likely a tendon injury than a muscle injury.
Yeah, it's more to be at that muscle tendon because these muscles attach to the tendon, and that's kind of the point where a lot of pulling's happening. So it tends to be right at that musculotendinous junction where they meet each other that this happens at.
Interesting. So, and we're not saying like, if you're not an explosive athlete, don't train this. Like, I think every person listening that cares about their health and their fitness would benefit from training both muscles and tendons.
Yeah.
However, I was just curious if like if someone like specifically was listening that's like, oh crap, I should be doing this. Or like, oh, I've had a lot of injuries. Because it could also be like, oh, I've had a lot of injuries, but I've never looked at it of muscle versus tendon.
Yeah. Yeah. And the way that I would look at this too is it's almost like a paradigm shift. Like if I'm lifting, I'm lifting. And if I'm training, then I'm getting stronger and I'm preventing these types of injuries. And hey, if you're doing that, you're way ahead of the game. Like just getting some movement in to prep yourself like that is, you're already crushing it. But how do we take it that step further? And that's, a lot of people that we work with, they want to take it that step further. Like, how do I dive into this? How do I ensure that I'm taking care of these small percentages to keep myself healthy because I produce a lot of force when I go to move. And at that point, we really have to dial in the program to not just say like, oh, any exercise will do fine, any weight will do fine. Go in, work up to whatever weight feels good for that day and do a few reps and call it good. So we do know that if you're loading in the protocol that Dr. Meserman and McMahon have provided in their research that 8 to 12 reps at 60 to 85% in those bigger muscle groups of the lower extremity, that you're getting tendon and muscular adaptation. Now, if you go to something that's more of like you're hanging out around 50% and you're just doing reps until your muscles can't take it anymore because of the lactate building up into them, we know at that point, like you're adapting the muscle, but the tendon's not adapting. So if you're questioning like, hey, what should I be doing? Well, if you do the one, you're going to cover both of them. If you do the other side, you're only be getting one of them. So we do know too that in like these higher volume type programs, at a certain point, you're only training the central fatigue mechanisms. You're only training the nervous system, the muscles and or the tendons. They're not adapting anymore. Like they've gone through the stressors that they can go through. The rest just becomes the nervous system. So we have to look at that too and just go like, hey, are you doing German volume squat training? And like, why are you doing that? Is it for mental fortitude and to condition the nervous system? Or is this an injury prevention program for the muscles and the tendons? And can they both exist with each other? Absolutely. But at what point in the year and at what point in the season is this happening at?
Yeah, and then also how often per week do they need to train their tendons? Is that part of the protocol as well?
It's a great question. Yeah. So typically it's 2 times a week at a minimum.
Okay.
So 2 to 3 times, 3 is the max. Past that, diminishing returns. Under 2 weeks, hey, it's still better than nothing. But 2 weeks is the best way to do that.
2 times per week.
2 times per week.
Yeah.
Yep. Like 2 different sessions, and it's just beginning of the week could be a front squat. Later in the week could be lunges. Beginning of the week could be deadlifts. Later in the week could be landmine deadlifts, right? It's just loading it heavy and slow in that rep scheme will help address both of those things.
I also, my last thought in all of this is like shouting out to maybe like the parents or the parents to, kids under 10 who, or like you're about to start a family and you say you've like been in the weight room and you've done some exercises, but you've never thought of it this way. Like, I really think that parents, especially to younger kids, would benefit from training like this because it would allow them to like play in the backyard with their kids more versus like sitting on the porch and watching your kids play. Like you can be out there playing tag because that is like explosive
Yeah.
movements, and this could like this perspective could almost like prevent injuries in the backyard playing with your children. And so I just wanted to like shout out to those, I guess, that demographic.
Yeah, and right, like we're looking at everyone's limited on time. Even like the best athletes, the top 1% of the one percenters, like they have a time frame that they have to get a lot of training into a little window. And when I look at it, it's like, yeah, if you have limited time, I'd want to address both of these things. I think the last thing I want to kind of touch on is that like the strength that you gain from this in adaptation of the tendon and the muscle gives you the buffer zone to not have injury with explosive stuff. But if you really want to decrease your injury with explosive stuff, it becomes strengthen it and also practice some of the explosive stuff so that you're taking care of both of those. And now you've become incredibly resilient. But the last point I want to add in is what's really interesting in the research. Um, I, I think it's something we already knew, but I think it's interesting for people to hear this. People that have had tendon pain or discomfort, and they go through this loading protocol and they see that the tendon structure is changing, may not change their pain, right? And that can be surprising because it's like, well, if the structure is changing, then shouldn't that change their pain? Well, that would be assuming that the structure is what's creating the pain. The structure is a signal that's going to the nervous system, and the nervous system is deciding what to do with that signal. So you can change the structure and not have an effect on pain. There's a huge psychosocial component to tendon type issues that researchers in the biomechanical field, they're starting to say, hey, we need to look more into that because we have good credible evidence now and good methodology showing that tendons are changing with this load and that it does become preventative. It can help with performance, but it may not change the pain response. It can change the pain response, but it may not change the pain response. So there's more to that that needs to be dived into, which we know as a whole athlete, it's not just about loading, it's how are you adapting to that load? And are you spending adequate time to learn how to adapt to it, or are you just putting your foot on the gas pedal over and over and over again without having that nourishment?
Love it. Let's dive into our hope stories, but this isn't my hope story, but I just want to share. We were watching a movie the other day, and this, you know, teenage daughter or granddaughter was talking to the grandfather and about life, and like I think she asked the question like, do you regret any moments in your life? And asked like, what about the hard moments? What about the challenging like times in your life? And he's like, life is all about adapting to those challenging moments. And Dylan and I looked at each other and we're like, yes, because it's life is not just about like what Dylan just said. It's not just about like adapting physically, like the muscles and the tendons and all that. It's like the mental adaptation and just like who you are as a whole, being able to adapt to any sort of stressor, whether it be a stressor from a workout or a stressor in your life in general. And so we're diving into our hope stories. That's not technically mine, but I wanted to share that little moment from the movie we watched.
Yeah, that's great.
So what's your hope story?
So I'm staying on the roll of my dad's birthday trip
Of course.
in Miami, and the last day that we're there, we had some downtime, got to hang out at the beach. Our flight was later that night, so we're at the beach, and it was hilarious because like three dudes on a trip who none of us packed a beach towel, so we're just sitting on the sand and like laying down in the sand. It's getting everywhere, right? And we're like, whatever, we're on the beach. This is enjoyable. And there's these two moments that were just like so precious. There were these moments of hope, but also these moments of, hey, prep for what you want to do in the future. So there was this older couple. I said that wrong. These older ladies that I think were friends, and we're just like on a trip. Like they look like they're in their 80s, and we're like, you know what? I want to go to the beach today. Let's go to the beach. And this one, she really wanted to go in the water, but she was afraid to because, oh my gosh, her walking on the sand was like, oof, like at least the sand's soft, so if you fall on it, you'll be okay.
Oh.
But balance was just not there, and there's just it was a rocky walk.
Mm.
And then you walk into the water, and the water's fighting against you further. And I'm like, oh, this isn't a good recipe. So she got to the edge of the water and was like, yeah, I really want to go in there, but the risk is higher than the benefit. So she
Mm.
just stayed on the shoreline. And then this guy, probably middle aged with his girlfriend, fiance, whatever, is walking towards the water. And this older lady just asked him, like, do you mind holding my hand and bringing me in the water? And then she like apologized to the girlfriend fiance. She's like, I'm so sorry. I don't want to like take your man, but I just really want to go in the water. And she was like, of course, like
Aw.
please like use him go in the water. So he brought her into the water just about knee deep.
Mhm.
And she was so excited and
Mm.
just so like this was my goal of the day. And I'm now in the water.
Mhm.
And you know, she was so funny because she kept waving to the girlfriend, like, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, her heart is melting
Yeah.
on the shore right now that her man is helping this precious lady
Yeah.
in and out of the water. So she was in and she came back out and she apologized again to her. And it was a split moment that I had of like how beautiful it was of like this human kindly helping this other human. And he was like protecting her in the water and
Mhm.
like giving her space, but making sure like he was right there because
Yeah.
he saw what I was seeing
Yeah.
and he knew like, hey, I don't want her to fall in this. And so, you know, so they got the shore, it was beautiful, but then I was also like, man, like you can prep for these things.
Mhm.
Like you can get yourself ready for this. And it doesn't start with what you do that morning. It starts with what you're doing in your 30s, in your 40s, your 50s, your 60s, 70s, 80s. Does it look different? Yes.
Mhm.
But can it be done? Absolutely. And it kind of gave me that push of like, hey, this is why we're doing this, is
Mhm.
so that people can have these meaningful athletic moments at any point in their age span. And then continuing on that story, there was a group of younger girls who were probably, if I had to guess, were like between 7 and 13, and they're in the water just getting bullied by the waves. But then they decided that they were gonna all three jump on each other to give each other a piggyback ride at the same time. I know the physics is not there for this equation to work out, and it didn't work out, but it was hilarious watching them do this
Mhm.
and flipping over each other, getting smacked by waves and, you know, salt water up the nose and could barely see and laughing and just trying it again with different methods. And I'm like, all three of you cannot give each other a piggyback ride at the same time. But I love that you're like, no limits.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to try to do this and kept trying to do it.
Who cares about physics? Let's do it.
That was like two different ends of the spectrum, like very careful in the water achieving a goal, and
Mhm.
then very like not careful but willing to keep trying it because I had a goal in mind. And
Mhm.
you know that hey, I would say it was just false hope. There
Yeah.
was not a framework in place for them to achieve this goal because it is unachievable.
Right.
Like three people can't be in the air carrying each other at the same time without a plane or some type
Right.
of flying device. So those are my hope stories.
Wow, I love those hope stories. That's so fun. Oh my gosh, my heart is melting. Um, my hope story is just like kind of simple. I feel like Dylan's are just so great, and so I feel weird sharing mine. But at the same time, like for the past few months, we've had the opportunity to work with tactical athletes and special operators in the military, and there's so many hope stories that I could share, but I just want to share like the fact that we're working with them is just really cool. It's awesome to see both the camaraderie and the resilience and the hard work of these different people that we've worked with. And um recently we were doing like a workout with them where they were establishing their 5 rep max of different lifts. And it was just so funny to see them like I say funny, but funny because some of them were super competitive and then others like really weren't. So they were doing their best, but they weren't necessarily looking at the person next to them to try and beat them. But then there were a couple guys who like would purposely wait until one person was done because they knew that that one person was going to probably beat the rest of the gym.
Mhm.
And then they would do it and then beat that person by 1 rep and stuff like that. And so it was just like it was so fun to watch like the competitiveness that these people had. But the one specific story I want to share it was cool. We got to get a couple of the guys 5-rep max like a week prior, and then we had more of the guys there like a week later. And the one guy thought that he was going to beat everybody from the first week, and then during the second time, this other guy was like beating everybody. And ironically, like they are great friends, like probably like closest best friends like out of the whole unit. And it was cool because the guy in the second session would do a lift. The guy that was in the first session started realizing that he was beating him. So without any warm up at all, he was just like, I'm gonna go do that. So like when he first tested, he ended up getting like a certain weight, but then he saw that his friend got a higher weight. So then he was like, I'm gonna go do that, and just did it with like no warm up at all. And it was funny because they would talk trash to each other, but then after every lift, they would give each other a hug. And I heard them say to each other, like, I'm so grateful, like, that you pushed me. I'm so thankful for your friendship. I love you, brother. Like, things like that. And I was just like, yes, like, that's what it's about. It's about, like, yes, like, the fun camaraderie trash talk, but then not taking that personally, but really knowing that like the trash talk is actually like the motivation and the encouragement, and then like hugging it out and just wanting the best for each other and thankful like for the camaraderie. I love that we're working with these tactical athletes. It's opened my perspective and my eyes to this amazing part of living in the United States and these people that serve us every day that we don't think about, and I would say that a lot of people take for granted, and it's been awesome to get to serve them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times we think of like the military sacrifice of like being in wartime and forget like all of the training that they're doing on a daily basis to stay ready in case that is to happen. And you see the like all the different trainings that they're going to, what their day looks like, and it's like, wow, like even in non-war times, like their sacrifice is incredible. Even just, moving and going to new locations for new trainings and their family coming with them. They're professional athletes that are not paid professional athlete salaries, and they don't have an off season.
Yeah, and they don't have like the luxury that professional athletes have. Like they're not, taking a really nice private jet from one location to the next. Like they're driving from Oklahoma or North Carolina through the night, or what was the one, Colorado Springs, all the way to upstate New York with no stopping, and then going into training immediately. Like they should be getting paid and treated like professional athletes, but they're not. And we're very grateful for them.
Yeah, and that's why we're thankful to be there, so that we can bring that to them of the type of treatment that
maybe
that
not
they
the
deserve.
maybe not the private jet, but we can bring
No, we're
like
not bringing that.
the personal or the private or what sorry, the treatment, like you said, the programming
and changing the perspective, because people think like pro athletes and they think like, oh, dry needling, shockwave, saunas, cold plunges, and it's like, no, like the sports science, they're like, let's get on the front end of these things, prevent these things, and these other things, yes, we have them for symptom management, but if we can get it to, or we don't need symptom management, well, then we've been successful.
Well, and the reality, to go back to our main point of like adaptability, right? The reality is in training, when they're at these different schools and in war, they're not going to have access to dry needling or cold plunging or anything like that. They need to know how to be able to adapt, and we need to work with them now so that their adaptability is better when those times come. And so to go back to our original point, it's like awesome getting to train them in adaptability.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. Great episode.
Great episode.
Great hope stories.
Oh, yeah.
I loved them.
Yeah, they were great. Have a great week, and remember, every day is not just a day to be hopeful, but an opportunity to become hope.
The Hope Not Know podcast is meant for educational, informational, and personal development purposes only, and does not constitute any health or medical advice. If you're looking for specific advice, connect with us to work with a Hope coach. The Hope Not Know podcast shall not be liable or responsible for any loss or damage allegedly arising from any information or suggestions in this podcast.